So we are going to record the session up until Tim and Neil have finished their presentations, and then in the recording we'll then stop. But just also to say, just the running order. The running order is, we have Sally Thomas, who's the Chief Exec of SFHA, doing some introductory comments on the toolkit and on preventing homelessness itself, and also Maggie Brunges from Homeless Network Scotland will also be introducing the session. We'll then go on to the research findings by Neil Morland Consultants, and Tim Gray from Neil Morland Consultants will take us through the self-reflection toolkit. And then, as I said, there'll be lots of opportunity to answer questions and make comments. So I'm going to hand you over to Sally, our Chief Exec. And could I just ask again if people could make sure they're on mute? Thank you.
Thanks, thanks, Ali. I have to remember to take myself off mute rather than make sure I'm offered in the first place. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see. Am I muted at the moment? Is that? Can everyone hear that?
Yes, we can hear you now, Sally.
Fine. Okay. Right. Okay. After that glitch, even after 2.5 years, see everyone this afternoon. I'm going to just say a few words, and then Maggie is going to say some complimentary words alongside mine. So it'd be great to hear Maggie after me, and then we'll hand back to Eileen. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to launch the research and self-evaluation toolkit for social housing providers, housing associations and local authorities, and co-ops indeed. And especially delighted that it's been a partnership project involving SFHA, Homeless Network Scotland, Community Scotland, Crisis and ALACHO, all organisations doing great work and great to work with. So it means we can just get a lot of added value out of what we do by working together and through our combined efforts. The idea for the research and toolkit came from the partners on the homelessness prevention strategy group who are here today. And while we have a really strong homelessness network safety net in Scotland, with the legal framework, collaboration and a strong political policy focus, what we felt was needed was a greater practical focus, specifically on what works, maybe even what doesn't, to prevent homelessness in the first place. Just as a very, very quick snapshot, there are 1.2 million people and rising living in Scotland, roughly 50-50 local authority and housing association, and that's 32 local authorities and 145 housing associations of many different scales, types, sizes, the length and breadth of the country. And what housing associations do is act as social purpose organisations who provide great homes. So great homes happens to be what they're best known for, but they do so much more as well. Which we'll explore a bit in my words, but also in the research and the toolkit. From the perspective of housing associations and indeed local authorities, clearly, their interest here is in tenancy sustainment. They not only provide great homes which are safe, warm, good quality, affordable, but they want people to stay in them. I mean, that's the top and bottom of it. There's no point in getting tenants into a home if they're not going to stay there. It's terrible for those tenants, it's terrible for the community, it's terrible for the housing association. So housing associations are laser focused on developing homes in communities that people are happy with. And they're largely successful in this. So in the latest Scottish Housing Regulator report, almost 9 out of 10 social housing tenants are satisfied with their homes and services. Numbers of evictions are low and continue to be even after COVID. And the eviction ban was lifted, but we cannot be complacent. And I'll come back in a minute to the latest figures just to illustrate that need not to be complacent. Eviction is always a last resort when all avenues have been exhausted, often avenues which take years to explore. And last but not least, and having said all of that, there's always room to reflect on practice and look for improvement. We can always do more, we can always do better. The research and toolkit also, of course, is a mind to the potential legislation on duties of public bodies to prevent homelessness, including proposals for RSLs to intervene earlier to prevent homelessness. Again, emphasising the importance of prevention and early intervention, rather than being on the back foot and firefighting, which inevitably results in very messy situations, huge expense for all concerned, hugely resource intensive, and above all, devastating for the people involved in that eviction. So this research and self-reflection toolkit is going to help social landlords to reflect on their current approach and identify opportunities to develop their own practice. Always learning, always improving. There's always more we can do. And we've never needed this more than now in the face of the challenges we're facing now and we know are coming. The facts and figures on homelessness, which I said I'd refer to a bit later in what I say, are illustrations of this. So while the recent homelessness figures are still below pre-pandemic levels, we can't be complacent. We can't just accept what we're seeing, especially as they're increasing from the private rented sector. People in temporary accommodation is increasing, and support needs are increasing, particularly around mental health. So having said all that, hope that you find the research and especially the toolkit really helpful and useful. We want to keep it fresh. We know there'll always be more good practice coming, so we want to capture that now and into the future. So always looking for ways to keep it up to date. And also, so it's very much a companion piece to the recent crisis report, 75 Ways to Prevent Homelessness, which was released last week. Finally, and perhaps obviously, if we are to achieve our shared goal of ending homelessness in Scotland, not only do we need to have a relentless focus on prevention through tenancy sustainment, we also need to incorporate the right to an adequate and accessible home in Scottish law. And finally, not least, we need to build a lot more social housing, making sure there are enough homes that are safe, warm, accessible and affordable, and in places people want to live. In other words, making rights real, and at the same time, making sure there's a home for everyone who needs one. And I'll hand over to Maggie.
Sally, thank you so much, and good afternoon everyone. It's really great to join you this afternoon to focus on this really important topic that Sally has outlined so well for us. I wonder if I could just then offer kind of two opening points that always feel from my perspective to be kind of one of the most useful places to start in discussions like the ones that we're having today. And firstly, I think is that there is a very strong belief in Scotland that homelessness can be ended. And that energy, which comes from across a range of sectors and services, including across kind of housing associations and cooperatives, should just never be dampened, should it? It should be constantly encouraged, because it's there despite the circumstances, which can feel really overwhelming. And I think this moment in time that we're going through at the moment is one of those circumstances. And those kind of feelings of feeling overwhelmed by circumstances affect people no more than those whose home, of course, is at risk. I think probably the second kind of opening point to offer is just this really strong knowledge in Scotland that housing ends homelessness. And we know it's not quite as simple as that. We know that every experience of homelessness is unique, but we know what binds them. What is common is, of course, the lack of housing. That home is just the best base for all of us to build and live our lives, and that most of us, with the right support, can flourish in an ordinary home as part of an ordinary community. But I guess what we also know is that at least 8% of the population, around 1 in 12 of us, will experience homelessness at some point in our lives in Scotland. And there's no doubt that on this call that includes some of us too. The critical role of housing then in that dilemma is something that also drew together a group of over 30 third and academic sector organisations at the start of the pandemic. And that was a collective called Everyone Home that warned in the very early days of the pandemic, alongside SFHA, many of us on the call, and many others, that the pandemic and its aftermath will create the very same conditions that create homelessness. So job loss, rent arrears, poverty, the breakdown of personal relationships, of living arrangements. And where we are now, 2.5 years later, of course, is that that's become clearer. It's emerging. And the latest homelessness figures actually showing what was feared to be the start of an upward trend in homelessness. That, of course, underpinned by this cost of living crisis that we're now contending with, and the inevitable recession that is sure to follow this period. And I guess that makes our key challenges huge, significant, and perhaps broadly in 3 parts, if that helps to kind of break it down a little. Firstly, of course, and as Sally said, making sure that we have the supply and access to housing in the places that people really want to live, accelerating efforts to reach those targets, those kind of independently calculated targets that have been agreed. Is the amount of housing that's needed in Scotland. How quickly can we get there to mitigate some of the impacts that we're feeling? Secondly, redressing this stubborn over-reliance on temporary accommodation in Scotland that we're familiar with, the length of time that people stay there, the harm that causes. And of course, we know that not all of that temporary accommodation is suitable. Some of it much better than others, and especially that of course is provided through kind of housing associations within community flats. And thirdly, the big questions round about changing the conditions that create homelessness, so poverty reduction, especially as the primary driver of homelessness. But all that, we know it means big choices on things like tax, welfare, employment, minimum incomes, on inequalities, on housing supply, on housing costs. And these big questions, the big drivers, are the ones that always sit in the medium to long term and don't come early enough for people that this is affecting, of course, today and tonight. And I guess it is a bit of a kind of grim backdrop. But I guess it's also the motivation that drove the research that's being published today and the toolkit that Sally mentioned and that we'll hear much more about shortly from Tim and from Neil. Because I think what that toolkit can do is really kind of buy in to that motivation that's out there, the kind of energy and that people want to do more, and particularly housing associations, those here today and others that know that more can be done to mitigate against some of those big challenges that are ahead of us. There's also some other really encouraging signs. Earlier this year, some of you may have connected in with a Heriot Watt University publication, which was commissioned by Crisis. And what they published was a set of kind of statistical modelling that forecast the impacts of different policy interventions on homelessness in Scotland. And what it showed was that the track laid by the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group that came together in 2017 and that put in place the National Ending Homelessness Together plan, that remains the right one. It was rapid rehousing as a cornerstone recommendation, and the kind of central component of the Ending Homelessness Together plan is still seen as a correct mechanism to chart this kind of medium to longer term route away from the reliance on temporary accommodation toward improved prevention and toward more settled accommodation for more people more quickly. And what that piece of work also did was it noted that rapid rehousing into settled accommodation, for example, through social housing quotas, stands out as having one of the biggest impacts in reducing homelessness forecast across all time horizons. And notably, the most significant impact in the short term. And that's something really to kind of hold on to, I think, in these conversations. I think what's also really interesting that was reported through the monitor was that around half of local authorities have already made changes to social housing allocation policies as a result of RRTPs, and many housing associations have too. So I guess just to kind of round off from me, it is understood that there are enormous pressures on housing at the moment, and on people that work in housing that are passionate and committed to providing the best housing available for people. We know that there's more people seeking housing more quickly as a result of changes to homelessness policy in Scotland, and of course as a result of changes to immigration legislation at a UK level too. And all that just becomes more reasons why it becomes so critically important that we take every opportunity to protect people's homes that are accommodated, to avoid eviction, all the associated harm, and to prevent homelessness earlier and closer to home. So thank you very much. We look forward to the discussion across the rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, Sally and Maggie. I think that both of those speeches have really set the context for why we need this research, and really why the toolkit is also so important in terms of thinking about our practice. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand you straight over to Neil Morland. So Neil Morland is from Morland Consultants, and they've been carrying out the research for us, working with Tim, who's going to speak later on. So Neil's going to take us through some of the key findings of the research, and then Tim will take us through the toolkit and how that will work. So over to you, Neil.
Thanks very much, Eileen, and thank you to Maggie and Sally for their introductory pieces. Just going to organise sharing my screen with you. Okay, can someone give me an idea that you can see my presentation and that all looks good? Yeah, thanks, Maggie. Okay, it's always nice to be able to work in Scotland. Neil Morland & Co has consultants. My company, we work across England, Scotland and Wales with local authorities, housing associations, voluntary organisations, but we particularly enjoy working in Scotland, not only because I live here, but also because there's a real genuine energy and passion you find in Scotland that preventing homelessness is tangibly achievable, and that ending homelessness is a very realistically achievable prospect. And certainly working with housing associations in Scotland, it's very clear when we look at our work as a whole, housing associations in Scotland really genuinely believe in the social bit of their role and their title, and that's very much at the forefront of what they do. So it's been great doing this project and collaborating with all the different partners, and it's one of those projects where we've taken as much from it as we've hopefully contributed. I wanted to start with a couple of comments from people who got involved with the research, and I'll come on to how we did the research and what we learned from it in a minute. This is what this research is about, really. It's about making sure people remain in their homes, and what I wanted to make sure was that their voice really was at the forefront of the presentation, because I think it's important that they're heard in this. And so you can read the quotes there for yourself. Really, putting someone in a house at the start is not the end. You have to provide the support to help people sustain it. And then the other quote about it, about someone saying it's not about stopping evictions, it's about starting belonging. And I think, you know, that those together really sum up what we're hoping to achieve from this research, and about having a focus on individuals thriving in their homes. There's many more commentary from tenants throughout the report, as much as there also is commentary from a whole range of stakeholders that got involved. It's well worth taking time to look at and consider people's thoughts as, in your own time. I'm not going to go through all of the kind of research context, because I think Sally and Maggie together have set that out really, really well in terms of why it was commissioned, who it was commissioned by, etc. So I'm not going to go back over all of that. But I will touch on our research methodology. We use a mixture of qualitative and quantitative research. So we did some statistical analysis, we did some literature analysis, we carried out a huge range of one-to-one interviews and a range of workshops as well with people that either had been homeless or were homeless, or people that were social housing tenants or had been social housing tenants. And huge thanks to TPAS Scotland and Homeless Network Scotland, who helped facilitate and enable those workshops to take place. And we had information provided to us via email and all kinds of other fashions around what people were doing and how they were doing it. And there's a huge bunch of partners that got involved in this, whether it be local authorities such as Perth and Kinross or Fife, or Dundee Council, or whether it be housing associations such as Queen's Cross or Wheatley or many others, and voluntary organisations such as Simon Community, that all got involved and all provided examples of what they were doing really, really well to protect homes and prevent evictions. And all of that, again, is included in the research. You can take time to look at all kinds of examples of good practice that people are already using, and the sector is already demonstrating how ably it can to protect homes and prevent evictions. I talked about that we did both qualitative and quantitative research, and we looked at a huge range of data. I'm not going to go through all the data that we looked at because it would be impossible and probably a bit too much. But I am going to look at a couple of headlines which I think is important for us to explore. The first is around evictions and abandonments. This research is about protecting homes and preventing evictions. So the starting point has got to be, well, what is the state of play around evictions? And Sally's already mentioned this, she's kind of previewed this really well. We know that evictions and abandonments have gone down as a result of the pandemic. We know that levels were relatively speaking low anyway in Scotland, and they continue to remain low. What we've got here is two sets of data for the same time period, both about evictions and abandonments. On the left hand side is RSL evictions, on the right hand side is local authority evictions. And what we can see is that in terms of RSLs, their abandonment levels are lower than local authority levels, and it's the other way around in terms of evictions. But in both parts of the social housing sector here, we see that abandonment rates are much higher than evictions, and there's something there for us to consider, I think, around what do we do to bring the number of abandonments down even further so they're nearer to the levels of evictions. And I appreciate by the nature of abandonment, it's not always easy to know someone is about to abandon a property. And so sometimes it can be hard to do some preemptive and upstream prevention work. But there's still, I think, a legitimate challenge there that we need to be aiming for. So that gives us an idea that we're doing quite well on eviction levels, and we've managed to sustain those low levels as we've gone through the pandemic. And the most recent data says that although there's been an increase, it's still far lower than it was pre-COVID. In terms of evictions, it's important to look at the actual individual particular aspects of what people are being evicted for. One of the key factors is, of course, in relation to arrears, rent arrears. We can see, again, over the time series here from 2014-50 through to 2021-2022, we can see that for RSLs, which is the blue line, evictions due to rent arrears as a percentage of rent due at the end of the year, rather, is really not changed much over a 6-year period. For local authorities, it has changed quite considerably. It's gone up, and there's a divergence in those rates as that time goes on. So there's something to consider about what's behind that divergence. Why are rent arrears steadily increasing in local authorities and not so in housing associations? And there's something to consider around what the pandemic's done for us in the sense that it's often thought that if that people will pay their rent, and if they don't, they'll get evicted. And so there's a motivating factor to pay the rent. And yet, of course, people weren't going to get evicted during the pandemic, and yet rent payments still continued to come in. There was no significant fall in rent payments, no significant increase in rent arrears. So there's something now, I think, some learning around behaviour and push and pull triggers around rent arrears and the potential threat of eviction. And of course, we know ultimately from huge amounts of research that evictions are expensive. They're expensive to the whole housing association or local authority in kind of different ways. And we know again from plenty of research previously that people are far more likely to pay their arrears when they are a tenant compared to when they're not a tenant. So there's something around how we adapt our policy and practice and continue to evolve the good work we're already doing around rent arrears. Sticking with the data, there's a huge amount of learning from the Scottish Government's homelessness statistics, again, that Sally's already mentioned, and Maggie, recent publication of this data. We know that looking at the national homelessness data, the number of people that are saying they made an application for homelessness assistance because they were previously a local authority tenant or previously a housing association tenant is about twice as high compared to the rates that are recorded by local authorities and housing associations for eviction and abandonments. So there's a gap there between what RSLs and local authorities are saying is actions they're taking that resulting in homelessness versus then the presentations that are happening at local authorities. Some of that gap might be explainable through concealed households, but that's not going to explain the whole picture. So there's some work there, I think, to be done to understand the difference between the rates of abandonment evictions that are leading to homelessness from RSLs, and then the presentation rates from people at a local authority front door that are saying, well, I was a local authority or a housing association tenant, I'm not now, and I need some assistance, please. Keeping with those Scottish Government homelessness statistics, we know that there's almost twice as many households coming from local authority tenancies compared to RSL tenancies. So again, there's something to consider around, well, why is that? What's happening? What's the driver behind that? And that, to an extent, that might correlate also with the higher rent arrear levels that are being shown in the previous statistic. There's also some interesting learning to gain from the fact that again, the homeless statistics show that 3% of cases are homelessness due to eviction from rent arrears, whereas which is quite a low level amongst the whole homelessness cohort that local authorities are dealing with, whereas far more common reported reasons for homelessness amongst tenants was domestic disputes involving violence or abuse, which accounted to 18% of cases, or non-violent relationship breakdown, which accounted to 17% of cases, or fleeing non-domestic violence, which also accounted for 70% of cases, or harassment, which accounted for a further 8% of cases. So there's something around, and these are all going to be factors that are less likely to be connected with eviction and much more likely to be connected with abandonment. And so again, it leads us back to that previous conversation we had, that previous learning point we had around those abandonment rates being much higher than eviction rates. And we can see here in some of the home statistics what might be driving those abandonments. So there's a question for us as housing associations and voluntary organisations and local authorities, what do we do to better or differently so that we can help prevent homelessness around some of these factors? Okay, let's move on. And let's look from some of the findings from our workshops. So we spoke to a huge number of tenants and former tenants and people that were or had previously experienced homelessness, all with the help of TPAS Scotland and Homeless Network Scotland. Inevitably, people's experiences were mixed. Some people were reporting very positive experiences, saying that they'd enjoyed really good relationships with their landlord and very much appreciated the support they'd received from their landlords. And many recognised how difficult it can be sometimes for social landlords to help people, particularly in cases of antisocial behaviour, or if the problems that people are having aren't so obvious and perhaps hidden from everyday view of the landlord. Inevitably, there were also some people that felt things could be different and better. There were some people that had negative experiences, and as a result of that, some criticism to make of how of their experience of living in social housing and their experiences with their landlord. And some of those experiences are listed here in front of you: not getting the right support when people move in, difficulties in understanding the complexity of welfare rights and feeling as though support was not on offer when they did move in or subsequent to moving in, Environmental health issues that are affecting their property not being addressed. Delays to receiving welfare grants so they can buy furniture or equipment being a particular criticism, and one we hear all over the country, all over across England, Scotland and Wales when we do this work around having the right stuff in the home from the outset makes such a difference to tenancies being sustainable. Only receiving short-term support when longer-term support was needed was a criticism made by people involved in the workshops. People feeling pressure to abandon due to lack of other options to move on or move to a different locality because they were in difficult or dangerous situations, which again I think connects to that issue of abandonment rates and the causes of homelessness that local authorities are recording that are associated around social behaviour and domestic abuse and what have you. Not feeling that they're getting the support they need when they need it, and people being reluctant to ask for the support if it's not obviously available. People don't feel they should or can ask. Feelings from some that housing officers don't have enough time for the tenants, and in some cases housing officers weren't inclined to even get to know tenants and engage with them. And then also some criticism around people just generally not receiving enough support if they were under threat from antisocial behaviour. And of course, lots of organisations are going to be doing all of this really, really well. And I guess that's a lot of the idea of this research is promoting where there is good work around tackling antisocial behaviour, for example, or preventing abandonments, and also why the self-reflection toolkit is so important, because it gives organisations an opportunity to reflect on some of these issues that are being raised by tenants and people that experience homelessness and consider what organisations might need to do differently or better as they move forward. We also spoke to, again, a big mixture of social landlords and organisations that work with social landlords, local authorities, housing associations, voluntary organisations, all of those had a big conversation with a huge number of organisations. And from that, we were able to pull out a huge amount of learning. Some of that was a good practices examples, of which these are just a tiny snapshot that we've threaded all through the report and into the self-reflection toolkit. So Perth and Kinross Council and also Fife Council, they've both each set up their own funds to help people move into their tenancies and get what they need rapidly at the beginning, so that they can set their tenancy up and they can get it off to the right kind of start with all the furniture and other practical things that they might need at the beginning of moving into their home. Queen's Cross Housing Association have got a whole approach around establishing positive relationships right from the start with their new tenants, that includes making contact with them from the outset, talking about financial inclusion early on, and looking at how people might be able to access more benefits, discussing how people are going to budget and pay for their energy and other bills, which of course is very pertinent at this point in time, and all kinds of other areas of people's finances. So really beginning that conversation about money and making their money work best for them right from the outset. Wheatley Group have reduced their neighbourhood patch sizes to around 200 homes, so it allows their neighbourhood officers time to build more relationships and better relationships with their tenants and be more able to establish what their tenants might need in terms of support, and better able to respond by using a whole variety of different services that the whole group can offer. We also offer visiting housing support to individuals who are at risk of becoming homeless or have recently experienced homelessness, and they're supporting around about 1,000 people a year in that respect. Dundee Council are currently working with Shelter on a pilot that's identifying tenants who are at high risk of eviction due to having significant rent arrears and were not engaged with a housing officer. Shelter provides intensive support to the person through a tailored approach, and they are achieving an engagement rate of around 50% of those who have refused to engage previously with the local authority. Some really good outcomes there from a whole mixture of organisations across the social housing sector and voluntary sector, which is good to see, and they say there's many more in the research report itself. From talking to all kinds of stakeholders, RSLs, local authorities, voluntary organisations, tenants themselves, people that had or were experiencing homelessness, we also learned around what came to us was a whole wider range of issues that are outside the direct control of particular organisations, but that were for the sector as a whole, and perhaps for a national conversation in some of these to to consider and to take some further action, because all of these issues are barriers to protecting homes. All of these are potential triggers that can result in an eviction. So resolving all of these is going to be making tenancies more successful and more sustainable. The first of these wider issues then that we picked up on was the Scottish Welfare Fund and how it's being administered in many local authority areas, with the perception from quite a lot of people that it was simply too slow to be effective in helping new tenants, and that it took them too long to get the money so that they could establish themselves quickly in a new tenancy, which is why some local authorities have looked to set up alternatives. So there's something to consider then about how we could make improvements to the Scottish Welfare Fund. The second of these was the effectiveness of the Section 11 referrals. Practice around here varies considerably across Scotland, with some local authorities being much more proactive in their response and being much more forward thinking in their prevention work compared to others. So again, there's something around the consistency, improving the consistency of how people respond, how local authorities respond to Section 11 referrals. The third of these issues was the SHAW standards, the Sustainable Housing on Release standards, that are meant to ensure that people have got somewhere suitable to live upon release from being in prison. Again, there was lots of feedback here that suggested these standards, the SHAW standards, are being applied very inconsistently and sometimes very ineffectively, which was resulting in just simply too many people losing their homes when it wasn't actually necessary for them to lose them. So there's something around reconsidering the enactment and the delivery of those SHAW standards. The fourth of these wider issues was around barriers to information sharing, particularly where the support providers perhaps working with RSLs or local authorities or perhaps other public bodies, and being able to get all that information across all those different stakeholders so everyone could work effectively together. And sometimes not using the data protection legislation to our best ability, and sometimes the data protection legislation being a barrier to sharing when it doesn't need to be, and just practice not being evolved enough so that we can readily and practically share information when we need to with who we need to. The fourth of these wider issues is around difficulties in accessing mental health services, which became a significant limiting factor in people being able to sustain their tenancy. So people being able to get the help and support they needed from statutory and voluntary mental health provision at the right time is really important, and that's simply not happening enough of the time. So there's something to consider there as well. We also got some feedback on inconsistencies of approaches between RSLs and local authorities in terms of practice of asking for rent in advance prior to the start of a tenancy, with what the amount of rent in advance required, how that needed to be paid being inconsistent, but also some requiring rent in advance and some RSLs and local authorities not requiring rent in advance. And with concerns actually even asking for rent in advance was potentially a causative factor for people being unable to sustain their tenancy or even start their tenancy on a good footing. So there's something around having, again, a national conversation around what's the practical benefits of rent in advance, what are we trying to achieve here, how can we make this work for everyone's advantage in the best possible way. We also picked up on issues around the ability to pay for two homes. People that are claiming welfare assistance through the transition from housing benefit to universal credit, this is no longer possible to receive income to pay for two homes, and this is now causing some problems and resulting in people not being able to sustain their homes. So again, there's something there around feeding that up to a national government level. We also picked up on some concerns around the lack of mobility within social housing. Sometimes people needing to move because they're facing harassment or domestic abuse, or they're overcrowded, and because they're not able to move easy enough, then they're abandoning their homes, and this is resulting in homelessness. So there's something about people's perceptions on how readily able are people to really make a move within the social housing sector when they need to do so. And then the final wider issue that we picked up on was around there needing to be greater clarity on who should fund tenancy sustainment work. There was a huge patchwork of arrangements across Scotland, with some housing associations providing their own tenancy sustainment work and some not. Many voluntary organisations involved in tenancy sustainment work, some of them getting funding from local government, some of them getting funding from other sources. There being no standard definition of what tenancy sustainment work is, no national set of performance monitors around tenancy sustainment work. So there's huge sort of question on all the whole kind of funding and then measuring of impact and outcomes of tenancy sustainment work. So alongside those wider issues and the good practice we picked up, we also identified 20 key factors that will help to protect homes and prevent evictions and ensure that tenancies are successful. And these are broken down into 8 different areas. And those 20 key factors are what we've used to inform and shape the new self-reflection toolkit that's been launched alongside the research today. And my counterpart, Tim, is going to speak to you about that in due course. So I'm going to stop here and hand back to Eileen.
Thank you. Thanks, Neil. That was really, really interesting. Really lots of food for thought, I think, for everybody in that. I think I was going to hand straight on to Tim, but just take the opportunity to just pick up on a couple of questions. And if anybody else has got a quick question, there will be more time later. If anybody's got a quick question for Neil, just lift your, do the usual thing with your hands. But Rhiannon, you've posted a question in the chat. I wondered if you wanted to come in and just ask that directly.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. I'm using new headphones, so wasn't sure if they were going to work. Yeah, I just wanted to, I was reflecting on, though, in your statistics, there was one about the number of presentations of people needing assistance with homelessness from local authority or RSL housing being higher than the number of kind of evictions or abandonments that were being counted by those landlords. And I was thinking probably that's because a lot of those are driven by relationship breakdown, whether that involves domestic abuse or other relationship breakdown. And I wondered if there was anything in the research around whether, you know, how often that actually leads to the end of a tenancy for everyone in that household, or whether there's anything around whether anyone in that household is able to maintain the tenancy going forward when there is relationship breakdown. I hope the question makes sense, but yeah, just if there was anything in the findings in the interviews or anything that came up around that.
So Neil or Tim,
Yeah.
actually, do you want to come back?
Tim might want to come in separately, and that's absolutely fine. But I think it's really hard to measure causes of abandonment and due to the nature of abandonment and people just fleeing the tenancy and kind of, you know, pushing the keys through the door or what have you, or not even doing that sometimes. And I think, you know, notwithstanding that, we should try harder to try and measure and understand what causes abandonment, but there's not enough good authoritative data at this time, and that's not just in Scotland. That's all across the UK. So no is the short answer, but we did pick up some huge range of stuff around good practice around trying to prevent evictions and abandonments due to domestic abuse. Fife have done a huge amount of work with Women's Aid Scotland and changed the way it runs its service so that their whole process is a lot more focused on the individual. They're using their Prevention of Homelessness Fund and using their Rapid Rehousing Transition Plan funding to provide a whole new approach to how they're working with people who are escaping domestic abuse. So we've got some good practice in the research that we're keen for people to look at, and I'm sure that Fife themselves, if you wanted to, could probably happily chat to you about, but there's no particular hard facts, hard data I can sort of say, I can point one way or the other, I'm afraid.
Thanks from Neil. Tim, did you want to come in?
I just add a little bit, but I mean, as you saw from the presentations, you know, domestic violence is a is a leading cause of homelessness from social housing tenancies as well as from other tenancies, and in fact, it's the leading cause of homelessness amongst women out of all causes of homelessness in Scotland. So it's a very important issue, and we spoke to Women's Aid and we spoke to a few organisations about how they work with domestic abuse, and I think it's fair to say that attitudes have changed. Whether they've changed everywhere is another question. There was some women's aid research in Fife that really highlighted the fact that housing associations and local authorities can sometimes have approaches to dealing with victims of domestic abuse which are not necessarily sympathetic. There can be this presumption that it's the woman who has to leave her home rather than the perpetrator. And I think good practice is to try and support the choice of the woman in those circumstances, whether they want to stay in their home or whether they don't. And it will be interesting to see what effect the new legislation has in changing that, because in theory it ought to empower landlords quite a lot more to be able to take action against perpetrators and allow women to stay in their accommodation. But the devil will be in the detail, I expect, in terms of how the law can be enforced. But some really sort of quite minor things, like if somebody's staying in their home, will the landlord actually come in and repair the damage that was caused during the abuse? That sort of thing. Is there money readily available to allow somebody to take a break and stay in a hotel for a couple of days? So there's all that sort of thing that we discovered can be useful, and I think there's quite a lot to learn in terms of good practice.
Oh, thanks for that, Tim. I think we'll move straight on now to your part of the presentation, Tim, which is around the self-reflection toolkit, and when we can come back to people for questions afterwards. So, yeah. So over to you, Tim.
Okay. Well, that first thing is, can I share my screen? So let's see if I can. Right. So I think that showed the screen, and now what I want to do is just make sure that is. I'll show the bit of the screen. Right. So hopefully you can see that now. Does that work? You can see the toolkit. So both the research and the toolkit are available on a link on the SFHA's website, which will be put in the chat after, at some point during this presentation or after it. So basically, you can click on a link, and it takes you to this toolkit. And what we tried to do here is to try and synthesize the information from the research that's already out there on tenancy sustainment, from the data to some extent, from what tenants told us, from what campaigning organisations told us, from what social landlords told us, in terms of, well, what really works, what are the important things to be able to do if you want to help sustain tenancies. And it's kind of interesting that actually quantified research to say, well, this intervention will save this many tenancies and will save you this much money, is quite hard to come by, in any of the research internationally. But what there does seem to be is a pretty strong consensus between what everybody says who's involved in this field and the research that has gone on in terms of the things that are important. So what we've tried to do is to distill those things into 20 factors that are important for landlords in tenancy sustainment, and then we've produced a self-reflection tool which allows a landlord to come into this and think, well, here's some pointers in these different areas. How well do I think I'm doing? What could be improvements on? So I'll show you what those are. But first of all, I'll just go through the 20 factors briefly. So here we go. So they're the sorts of things you might expect, right? So we've grouped them into different areas: receiving referrals, making allocations, welcoming new tenants, and so on. So the first one is proper identification of support needs prior to referral to a new tenancy. It's really good to make something start off if you understand the difficulties of a tenant and before they move in, so that you're able to target your support appropriately, take appropriate action. Information sharing is really important between local authorities and housing associations and local authority homelessness and landlord functions, so that we can get that information in advance, so landlords know where they are. And then sensitive allocation of properties to try and make sure that tenants settle into their home and sustain their tenancies, so that they've got some choice about where they are housed, the right information to make that choice, bearing in mind, of course, that there's only so much social housing to go around and not everybody can have everything they want. Welcoming new tenants. So lots of people said that it's really important to take time to establish positive relationships. Probably, if there's one key thing that came out of the work, is that the relationship between tenants and their landlords, and those positive and being positive and trusting, is probably the key factor in the whole thing. So that if there are problems that tenants will talk about them, that they're spotted early, and that action can be taken on the basis of a trusted relationship. And you know, unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. I think it happens quite a lot, but it doesn't always happen in terms of those relationships being able to be established. Don't assume that new tenants have all the knowledge they need. Quite a lot of tenants told us that actually it can be really daunting to move into a tenancy in terms of the amount of information that you've got to get your head around, particularly if you come from a difficult situation. So things like welfare rights, utilities, budgeting, all those sorts of things. You know, it's important to make sure that actually people understand where they are with those things. Yeah, tenants should be enabled to assist to furnish and equip their properties, because there's nothing worse than moving into a property and staying there for 2 or 3 weeks or something without you know, it's just bare floors and nothing to help you. So that sort of stuff is really important in terms of getting tenancies off to the right foot. Similarly, you don't want to start off tenancies off in debt so much as obviously landlords need to maximise their income in order to pay their way. It shouldn't really be at the expense of tenants who actually can't afford to make payments on 2 homes or pay rent in advance if they just don't have any money. Okay, really important in terms of understanding and advancing equality to take account of different people being different and having different circumstances and different, you know, ways of understanding things, backgrounds, and so on. So that's really important. Tenant profiling can be good. Queen's Cross do a really good tenant profiling exercise where they interview their tenants every 3 years to see what's going on for them. Communicating effectively is not the same for everybody. So communicating with older people is not the same as communicating with younger people in terms of the preferred methods necessarily. Some people have real language difficulties, visual impairments and so on. So just standard ways of communicating, you know, in writing or online or whatever doesn't necessarily work. You know, it's important to understand what different tenants will need and to visit people where necessary. Understanding risks. I mean, there's some great work being done by some organisations in terms of risk profiling. So use of data is great if you can pick up things early, if you can understand the issues that people might be facing and the things that are more likely to make tenancies break down. You can use services like caretaking management. Doesn't all have to be about home visits by housing officers in terms of understanding where there might be a risk and so on. So if you've got a contact with tenants or a way, then let's make use of it to understand if there are tenancy sustainment issues that come up. Staff might need specialist training, as we just alluded to, and able to respond sensitively to things like domestic abuse, which is easy to get wrong. Partner collaboration is really important. Some tenants just won't talk to their landlords about being in debt, and so can you help them talk to somebody else? Multidisciplinary agencies in partnership where some people provide different sorts of support, but they're working together is really important. Antisocial behaviour came up so often when we talk to tenants in terms of these are the things that make people want to move because they just feel it's so unpleasant in their home because of what's going on around them that they just feel tempted to up sticks and go. So you know, it can be very difficult to solve, but it can be a really difficult issue for tenants who feel trapped in a situation where they can't get away from antisocial behaviour. Flexible use of transfers can be helpful and probably doesn't go on enough. Okay, it can take lots of attempts sometimes before people will talk. I mean, some tenants say it's clearly good to intervene early if you can, to get to know people, to ask in advance, you know, is there anything wrong? How's it going? You know, this sort of stuff, so that people will tell you. But it's also true that some people just won't actually react to their situation until it's a crisis point. So it's important to, at every stage, because there might be an opportunity at any stage where actually this is the point where somebody will work with you and engage. So important not to give up. And connection into local communities and services came up a lot as well. You know, you're moving into a new home. Actually, can you make a link and an integration with the things that are going on that are relevant to you in that community in terms of, you know, local services that you might be interested in, clubs, things that are going on, so you feel that it's your home. Really important around arrears and debts, to provide specialist advice. A lot of people said that really saved them when they got that sort of advice, somebody who was really able to understand and unravel the complexity of their financial situation. Payment plans obviously should be realistic, you know, otherwise people just can't handle them and they give up. And yeah, supporting tenants to seek advice early so that they've got access to, you know, legal support if they get into arrears and difficulties. So that's what all this is based on, but the actual tool has even more stuff in it. So I'll just give you an example. Basically, you know, you find an issue like identification of support needs prior to referral. There's some pointers. So in this case, it's saying in order for tenancies to start well, important for landlords to know key information. Then it asks some questions. So do you know enough about the support needs and risks relating to prospective tenants before they're offered a property? You know, including all tenants, not just the Section 5 ones where the local authority is obliged to tell you something. If not, what can you do to address this? So the idea is that you type in here, you write in your strengths, and if there's any gaps, you identify those and you write them down, and then next steps and priorities. So this can form the beginning of a plan, and you also can give yourself an overall rating. So you can say that you're amber. I mean, this is meant to be red, amber, green. It's actually red, orange, and yellow, isn't it? But it's meant to be red, amber, green. So you can you know, give yourself a green or red. Now, I think it's important that you're not limited to these prompters, and so you can figure it out for yourself what you think might be important in relation to this issue. But hopefully, it's helpful in getting that thinking process going. And then similarly, there's information about information sharing, about allocation of properties, including tenant choice. You know, what are the issues there? How do you manage that balance between offering people information and choice with actually letting your properties quickly to people who need homes and not barring people who are in the greatest need? Relationships between landlords and tenants, helping people settle. How do you organise yourself to make sure people have got the right furniture and equipment? What's your approach to rent in advance and tenants liable for rent on 2 homes? Inequality sensitive practice, so looking at domestic abuse, young tenants, refugees, approaches to written communications with tenants, letters, texts online, and so on. How are you getting on there? Identifying risks and intervening early. We haven't got time, obviously, to go through all these in detail, but you get the idea. There's a lot of areas that we're looking at here that you can think, well, what does my practice look like in this area? Am I doing as much as I could? What could we do as a next step to make things work, to work things better? Antisocial behaviour and harassment, positive tenant and community connections, supporting arrears and debt. You know, how do you use notices of proceedings? What is your process if you're taking people to court? When do you offer support, etc. And then there's a section on funding tenancy sustainment work, which is sort of reflection, really. There isn't a score here, but how does there is a score. There you are. How does that work in terms of your funding? And then finally, just to go on to evidence of success, we'd really like to know, you know, how the practice that you've got is developing and what works, so we can add to this in the future and broadcast basically where there's evidence that a particular way of working works. And Eileen would be keen to hear from you about that. But I'll stop there just to try not to overrun too much. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. That was really useful. And I think what I should say that we did actually test this out as well